You just made a mistake you can't undo, Ava Williams said softly, her voice steady in a room that had already decided she didn't matter. The sound that followed wasn't loud, but it cut through the courtroom like a crack in glass, sharp enough to make a few heads turn and just as quickly turn away. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, casting a pale, almost sterile glow across polished wooden benches and the cold gray floor, where every step echoed just a little too long. Ava stood still near the defense table, her posture upright, her chin level, her hands resting calmly at her sides, as if she were holding something invisible together inside her chest. To anyone watching, she looked like another name on a docket, another face passing through a system that moved too fast to care and too slow to fix anything. Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted his stance a few feet away, his uniform crisp, badge catching the overhead light, his expression unreadable in the way authority often is when it assumes it will never be questioned. Around them, murmurs flickered and faded like static, quickly replaced by that heavy courtroom silence that always seemed to favor power over truth. Ava's eyes moved once, not in fear, but in quiet observation, taking in the rows of spectators who avoided her gaze, the clerk shuffling papers without looking up, the judge's empty chair looming at the front like a symbol waiting to be claimed. 8 seconds passed, maybe 10, though it felt longer, stretched thin by tension no one wanted to acknowledge. Ava inhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take when you decide not to react, when you choose control over chaos, dignity over impulse. A faint reflection of sunlight slipped through the high windows, catching the edge of her cheek, tracing a line of light that contrasted sharply against the shadowed room, as if the world outside still believed in something brighter than what was happening inside these walls. "You're violating procedure," she added, not louder this time, just clearer, her words landing with precision instead of force. A few people shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, not because of what she said, but because of how certain she sounded. Brooks let out a short breath, almost a scoff, the kind that dismissed without engaging, and turned slightly as if the moment had already passed. But it hadn't. Something subtle had shifted, not in the room, not yet, but in the space around Ava, like the quiet before a storm no one sees coming. Her fingers tightened just slightly, then relaxed again, a controlled motion, deliberate, practiced, the gesture of someone who had learned long ago that the way you hold yourself can matter more than anything you say. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for something to break or reveal itself. Somewhere in the back, a door creaked open, barely noticeable, a thin slice of movement against the stillness, but Ava didn't turn. She didn't need to. Her focus remained forward, steady, unshaken, fixed on that empty judge's seat at the front of the room, the one everyone respected but no one questioned. And in that moment, before anyone understood why, before anyone realized what they had overlooked, Ava Williams stood there not as someone out of place, but as someone who had already stepped into a role the room had yet to recognize. The courtroom did not move, but it breathed differently now, like something unseen had entered and settled between the rows of polished wood and quiet judgment. Ava Williams remained exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze unwavering, as if time had slowed around her alone. A faint ringing lingered in her ears, not from anything loud, but from the weight of being dismissed in a place that claimed to hear everyone equally. She had felt that before, in smaller rooms, in offices with closed doors, in conversations where her words were acknowledged but never truly received. But this was different. This was a courtroom, a place where procedure was supposed to mean protection, where every step followed a rule, every voice carried a right. That was what she had studied, what she had believed in, what had carried her through long nights under dim desk lamps and stacks of legal texts that smelled faintly of dust and ink. Ava shifted her weight slightly, the movement almost imperceptible, the kind that came from discipline rather than discomfort. Her suit was simple, charcoal gray, tailored but unassuming, the fabric catching just enough light to outline her form without drawing attention. It was not the kind of outfit that demanded respect, but it was the kind that held it quietly, waiting to be recognized. Around her, the room resumed its low hum, voices returning in cautious whispers, like people testing whether it was safe to speak again. Officer Brooks leaned toward another officer, murmuring something under his breath, his posture loose now, confident again, as if whatever moment had passed was no longer worth his concern. The clerk cleared his throat and shuffled papers with renewed focus, avoiding eye contact with Ava entirely. A man in the second row adjusted his tie, glancing briefly in her direction before looking away, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and discomfort. Ava noticed all of it, not because she was searching for validation, but because she had learned to read rooms that refused to read her. Every shift, every glance, every silence told a story, and she listened without reacting. 12 feet away, the judge's bench stood elevated, its dark wood polished to a near mirror finish, reflecting fragments of light from the overhead fixtures. The chair behind it remained empty, slightly angled, as if someone had just left or was about to arrive. Ava's eyes lingered there for a moment longer than before, not with longing, not with doubt, but with something steadier, something rooted in certainty. She knew why she was here. Not as they saw her, not as a name called without context or a presence reduced to assumption, but as someone who had earned her place in this room long before she stepped into it. The memory surfaced quietly, unannounced, of a letter folded carefully in her bag, the official seal pressed into its corner, the words inside confirming what no one here had yet realized. Temporary assignment. Acting presiding authority. Effective immediately. She had read it 3 times that morning, not because she doubted it, but because she understood what it meant. Not just a position, but a responsibility. Not just a title, but a test. Ava exhaled slowly, her breath measured, controlled, grounding her in the present as the past settled back into place. Somewhere behind her, the courtroom door shifted again, this time with purpose, the sound more defined, more deliberate. Footsteps followed, quick and uneven, echoing lightly across the floor. A clerk from the administrative office appeared at the edge of the room, papers clutched tightly in one hand, eyes scanning until they landed on the front of the courtroom. He hesitated for half a second, as if recalibrating what he expected to see, then stepped forward with urgency that broke the fragile calm. Ava did not turn immediately. She let the moment unfold, let the room feel the change before acknowledging it. Officer Brooks straightened slightly, his attention drawn to the sudden movement, his earlier confidence flickering just enough to register uncertainty. The whispers faded again, replaced by a sharper silence, one that carried anticipation instead of dismissal. Ava finally shifted her gaze, not toward the officer, not toward the spectators, but toward the bench, the place that defined the room and everything within it. Her hands moved, slow and deliberate, adjusting the cuff of her sleeve, smoothing a line that did not need smoothing, a small ritual of composure that signaled readiness more than correction. She took a single step forward, the sound of her shoe against the floor soft but distinct, a quiet declaration that did not ask for permission. And in that step, something changed, not in her, but in how the space around her began to respond, as if the courtroom itself was starting to recognize what it had overlooked all along. The sound of that single step lingered longer than it should have, stretching across the polished floor as if the room itself was deciding whether to accept it or resist it. Ava Williams did not rush the next one. She moved with a measured pace, steady and intentional, each footfall quiet but undeniable, closing the distance between where she had been placed and where she was meant to stand. The air shifted again, this time sharper, more focused, like a lens adjusting. Into clarity. The administrative clerk reached the center aisle, breath slightly uneven, his grip tightening on the papers in his hand. He glanced once toward Officer Brooks, then toward the empty bench, then finally at Ava, recognition flickering across his face in a way that could not be mistaken. It was not surprise alone. It was correction. Court, he began, his voice catching for half a second before settling into formality. We have an update regarding presiding authority for this session. The words landed differently than anything spoken before, cutting through the assumptions that had quietly defined the room. Brooks straightened fully now, his shoulders tightening, the casual edge gone from his posture. He looked toward the bench, then toward the clerk, then back at Ava, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that did not match. Ava continued forward, her expression unchanged, her focus unwavering, not on any individual in the room, but on the structure that governed them all. The elevated bench stood just ahead, for steps leading up to it, each one worn slightly at the edges from years of use. She reached the base of those steps and paused, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, as if marking the threshold between perception and truth. The clerk cleared his throat again, louder this time, forcing the room to listen. "Effective immediately," he read, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. "The Honorable Ava Williams has been appointed as acting presiding judge for this court." The sentence hung in the air, complete and irreversible. A ripple moved through the courtroom, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. A woman in the front row blinked twice, her mouth parting slightly as she turned to the man beside her. The clerk at the desk froze mid-motion, a stack of documents held halfway between one side of the table and the other. Brooks did not speak. He could not. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing just enough to show that something fundamental had shifted beneath his certainty. Ava lifted her foot and stepped onto the first stair. The sound was soft, but in the silence that followed, it carried weight. One step, then another, her movements calm, deliberate, grounded in a confidence that did not need to announce itself. She reached the top and turned, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the natural ease of someone who belonged exactly where she stood. For a brief moment, she looked out over the room, her gaze moving across faces that had already begun to change, expressions reshaping from dismissal into something closer to awareness. She did not linger on Brooks, though he stood directly in her line of sight. She did not need to. The shift in the room spoke louder than any confrontation could. Ava moved behind the bench, her hand brushing lightly against the polished wood as she stepped into position. The chair waited, unchanged, indifferent to who occupied it, yet somehow transformed the moment she did. She adjusted it slightly, the quiet scrape against the floor echoing just enough to mark the transition, then sat, her posture upright, composed, her presence filling the space in a way that could not be ignored. The light from the high windows fell across her shoulders, softening the edges of the scene while sharpening its meaning. Below, Brooks lowered his gaze for the first time, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something he had assumed no longer held. The clerk exhaled slowly, as if releasing tension he had been carrying since he entered. Ava placed her hands gently on the bench, fingers relaxed, her voice calm when it came, clear and steady, not raised, not forced, but undeniable. "We will proceed," she said, and in that moment, the room did not just hear her. It understood. The gavel rested just inches from Ava Williams's hand, untouched, yet its presence seemed louder than any sound that had filled the courtroom before. No one moved. No one interrupted. Even the air felt disciplined now, held in place by a structure that had finally remembered its purpose. Ava sat with her shoulders squared and her gaze level, her voice no longer needing to push against resistance, because the resistance had already begun to fold into silence. She did not raise her tone. She did not demand attention. She simply allowed the authority of the bench to settle around her like something that had always belonged there. "Clerk," she said evenly, her eyes shifting slightly to the right. "Please confirm the case number and charges for the record." The clerk startled slightly, as if being called back into motion after forgetting his role, then quickly straightened the stack of documents in front of him. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, the title coming out a fraction slower than it should have, as though his mind was still catching up to his words. Papers slid softly against each other as he found the correct file, the sound small but precise in the now-ordered room. Ava listened without interruption, her attention complete, her stillness intentional. Every movement she made was controlled, every pause measured, not to create tension, but to remove confusion. Below her, Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing where he had been, though his posture no longer carried the same ease. His hands rested at his sides, fingers slightly curled, the confident rhythm he had held earlier replaced by a quiet uncertainty that showed in the subtle tightening of his jaw. He looked toward the bench once, then away, then back again, as if trying to decide where to place his focus without drawing more attention to himself. Ava noticed, not directly, not with any visible reaction, but in the way her timing adjusted just slightly, giving space for the room to settle into its new reality. "Before we proceed," she continued, her voice calm and even. "I will address a procedural concern that occurred moments ago." The sentence did not accuse. It did not escalate, but it shifted the weight of the room once again, redirecting attention with quiet precision. A man in the second row leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening more closely now. The clerk paused mid-page, his eyes lifting briefly toward Ava before returning to the document. Brooks's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Ava did not look at him yet. Instead, she placed her hands lightly on the bench, fingers resting flat against the smooth wood, grounding herself in the structure she represented. "This court operates under clear guidelines," she said, each word steady, deliberate. "And every individual present, regardless of role, is expected to follow them." Her tone remained neutral, but the meaning carried through the room with unmistakable clarity. She turned her head slightly now, her gaze aligning with Brooks for the first time since taking the bench. It was not a confrontational look. It was not sharp or hostile. It was direct, composed, and grounded in something far more powerful than emotion. "Officer," she said, not raising her voice, not softening it either, "do you understand the procedures governing conduct within this courtroom?" The question hung there, simple in structure, complex in implication. Brooks opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, the answer caught somewhere between instinct and realization. For a moment, the silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but instructive, like a pause meant to be filled with thought rather than reaction. Ava did not rush him. She did not repeat the question. She allowed the space to do its work. Around them, the room remained still, every eye now aware that something more significant than a routine hearing was unfolding. Brooks finally nodded, a small movement, controlled, his voice quieter than before when it came. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, the words measured, careful, stripped of the earlier certainty. Ava held his gaze for one more second, then gave a slight nod of her own, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. "Good," she replied. She turned her attention back to the clerk, the transition smooth, intentional, signaling that the focus of the court had shifted back to order. "Continue," she said, and as the clerk resumed reading, the courtroom followed, not because it was told to, but because it now understood where authority truly rested. The clerk's voice continued, steady but slightly tighter than before, each word now carrying the awareness that every detail mattered in a room that had fully awakened to its own rules. Ava Williams listened without interruption, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that followed her earlier question, something deeper than silence, something closer to accountability. The case. Details unfolded in measured cadence, names, dates, charges, each one placed carefully into the record like pieces of a structure that could no longer afford imbalance. Ava's eyes moved only when necessary, tracking the flow of information, absorbing it, weighing it, not as an observer, but as the one responsible for its direction. Below her, Officer Daniel Brooks remained still, though the stillness was no longer casual. It carried awareness now, a recognition that the space he stood in had rules that extended beyond his assumption of control. His gaze lowered briefly toward the floor, then returned forward, not challenging, not avoiding, but recalibrating. Ava noticed the shift, not with reaction, but with timing. She allowed the clerk to finish, allowed the room to settle into the rhythm of order, then placed her hand lightly on the bench, signaling a pause that did not need to be announced. "For the record," she said, her voice calm, evenly paced, "this court will ensure that all proceedings align with established protocol from this point forward." The statement was simple, but it carried weight, not because it was forceful, but because it was final. A woman seated near the aisle adjusted her posture, her attention fixed now with a clarity that had not been there before. A man in the back row leaned forward slightly, his expression no longer passive, but engaged, as if witnessing something that extended beyond the case itself. Ava turned her gaze downward toward the documents in front of her, scanning them briefly, her movements efficient, precise. She did not linger, did not overanalyze. She trusted her preparation, the years behind her, the discipline that had shaped the way she processed every detail. Then she looked up again, her focus returning to the center of the room. "Officer Brooks," she said, her tone unchanged, steady, direct, "step forward, please." The The request was not loud, but it carried authority that left no room for hesitation. Brooks paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register the shift from being part of the background to being part of the record, then took a step forward. The sound of his shoe against the floor echoed. Slightly, a contrast to the earlier confidence that had marked his presence. He stopped at the designated position, his posture straight, his hands now loosely clasped in front of him, a small but telling adjustment. Ava watched him for a moment, not critically, not emotionally, but with the measured attention of someone assessing alignment with the structure she upheld. You acknowledged understanding courtroom procedures, she continued, her voice calm. And that includes conduct toward all individuals present. Brooks nodded once, the movement controlled, his response immediate this time. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice quieter, more deliberate. Ava held the pause again, allowing the acknowledgement to settle into the room, allowing everyone present to recognize that the conversation was no longer about assumption, but about accountability within defined boundaries. Then this court expects that standard to be maintained consistently, she said, her words precise, leaving no ambiguity. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The clarity was enough. Brooks's expression shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in acceptance, a subtle recognition that the structure of the room now extended fully around him. Ava gave a small nod, then turned her attention back to the case, her movement smooth, signaling the transition from correction to continuation. We will proceed with opening statements, she said, her voice steady, guiding the room forward. The attorneys at their respective tables adjusted their files, their earlier hesitation replaced by focus, their roles now clearly defined within the restored order. As the first attorney stood, papers in hand, the room followed the motion naturally, not out of habit, but out of alignment with the authority that had been reestablished. Ava remained still, her presence anchoring the space, her gaze attentive, her posture unwavering. The courtroom no longer felt uncertain. It felt structured, deliberate, and for the first time since the session began, it felt like a place where the process would be honored, not assumed. And in that shift, quiet but undeniable, the meaning of the moment settled deeper than any. Words spoken, carried not by volume, but by the steady, controlled power of someone who understood exactly what justice required and chose to uphold it without compromise. The attorney's voice carried across the courtroom, steady and practiced, outlining arguments that now felt secondary to something deeper unfolding beneath the surface. Ava Williams listened with the same composed attention, her eyes focused, her posture unchanged, but the weight of the room had shifted into a quieter place, a space where every word was measured not just for meaning, but for integrity. The overhead lights hummed softly, blending with the faint sound of pages turning and pens moving across paper, creating a rhythm that felt almost distant compared to the stillness anchored at the bench. Ava's hands rested lightly before her, fingers relaxed, her breathing even, controlled, each inhale and exhale grounding her in the moment. She did not rush the proceedings. She allowed them to unfold at their proper pace, as they were meant to, without pressure, without distortion. Below her, Officer Daniel Brooks had stepped back into position, but something in his stance remained altered, less rigid, more aware, as if the structure of the courtroom now pressed against him from all sides instead of supporting him from beneath. He kept his gaze forward, but there was a quiet restraint in his posture, a recognition that the space he occupied was no longer shaped by assumption. Ava noticed the shift again, not with reaction, but with understanding. She had seen it before, in classrooms, in hearings, in moments where people realized that authority did not belong to them, but to the system they were meant to serve. The attorney paused briefly, flipping a page, the soft rustle breaking the flow for just a second before continuing. Ava's eyes moved toward the window for a fraction of a moment, where late morning light filtered through the glass in thin, pale lines, stretching across the floor and up the side of the bench. Dust particles drifted slowly within the beams, visible only because of the light that revealed them, floating without urgency, without direction. The image held for a second longer than expected, and in that stillness, something settled deeper inside her, not emotion, not distraction, but clarity. She had spent years preparing for moments like this, not the recognition, not the title, but the responsibility of holding a space steady when it tried to tilt. The courtroom was quiet again, not empty, not tense, but balanced, held together by something stronger than control. Ava leaned back slightly, just enough to release tension from her shoulders, her gaze returning to the attorney as he concluded his statement. The words landed cleanly, without resistance, as if the room had accepted its rhythm. Ava gave a small nod, acknowledging the completion, then allowed a brief pause to follow, the kind that gave space for everything said to settle into place. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was no longer heavy. It was intentional. Ava's hand moved toward the gavel, not to strike it, but to rest beside it, her fingers hovering just above the smooth surface, as if acknowledging its presence rather than using it. Her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, carrying through the room without effort. The court recognizes the statements presented, she said, each word clear, grounded, without excess. She did not elaborate. She did not interrupt the flow. She allowed the process to breathe. Below, Brooks shifted his weight slightly, a small adjustment that might have gone unnoticed before, but now carried meaning in its restraint. Ava's gaze lowered briefly, not to him, but to the record, confirming alignment, confirming continuity. Then she looked up again, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. The light from the window had shifted slightly, brighter now, touching the edge of the bench and reflecting softly against the polished surface. It did not demand attention, but it changed the way everything looked, adding warmth to a space that had felt cold only moments before. Ava inhaled slowly, then exhaled, her voice returning once more, measured, precise. "We will continue," she said, and in that quiet statement, the room followed, not because it was instructed to, but because it now moved in alignment with something it could finally recognize as true authority. The final word of the attorney settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending out quiet ripples that no one could ignore anymore. Ava Williams remained composed at the bench, but something in her gaze sharpened, not with intensity, but with recognition. She had heard enough, not just of the case, but of everything surrounding it, the tone, the behavior, the subtle imbalances that had tried to pass unnoticed earlier. Her fingers moved slightly against the surface of the bench, not restless, but intentional, as if aligning thought with action. She glanced down at the record one more time, then closed the folder gently, the soft sound echoing just enough to signal a shift. "Before this court proceeds to deliberation," she said, her voice calm but carrying a new weight, "there is a matter that requires formal acknowledgement." The words drew immediate attention. Even the smallest movements in the room stilled, as if everyone understood that what came next would define more than the outcome of the case. Ava lifted her eyes, her gaze settling not broadly across the room, but precisely where it needed to be. "Officer Brooks," she continued, her tone even, "earlier conduct within this courtroom did not align with the standards required by this institution." The statement was not raised. It was not emotional, but it landed with clarity that could not be softened. Brooks's posture shifted again, this time more visibly, his shoulders tightening, his breath slowing as if he were recalibrating in real time. He did not look away, but he no longer held the same certainty in his stance. Ava allowed the silence to follow, not as pressure, but as space for truth to exist without interruption. The courtroom remained still, every person present now fully aware that they were witnessing something rare, something that could not be undone or ignored. Ava's voice came again, steady, deliberate. "This court does not operate on assumption," she said, "and it does not permit deviation from procedure based on perception, position, or personal judgment." Each word was placed carefully, not to accuse, but to define. Brooks swallowed once a small movement, controlled, his hands adjusting slightly, as if grounding himself in the moment. For the first time since the session began, his voice carried something different when he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, measured, careful, "I acknowledge that my conduct did not meet the expected standard." The admission was simple, but it changed the room. Ava held his gaze for a brief moment, not in challenge, but in recognition of the shift. She gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as acceptance of accountability. "Acknowledgement is the first step," she replied, her tone unchanged. But consistency is what sustains integrity. She paused again, allowing the meaning to settle, allowing the room to absorb not just the words, but the principle behind them. A faint movement in the gallery, someone shifting in their seat, someone else exhaling quietly, the kind of reactions that came when tension released into understanding. Ava turned her attention back to the bench, her hand resting lightly near the gavel, not needing to use it, but aware of its presence. The light from the window had shifted further now, casting a warmer tone across the courtroom, softening the edges of faces that had once seemed distant. Ava's voice returned, steady, guiding. "This matter will be noted in the official record," she said, her words precise, final. "And this court will proceed under full adherence to established procedure." There was no escalation, no reprimand beyond what was necessary. Only clarity, only structure. Brooks nodded once more, this time without hesitation, his posture aligning fully with the expectations set before him. Ava watched for a second longer, then allowed her gaze to move forward again, returning the focus to the case itself. But something had already changed, something deeper than the outcome of any legal argument. The courtroom no longer held the imbalance it had at the beginning. It held recognition. It held correction. And as Ava Williams sat at the bench, composed and unwavering, the truth of the moment settled quietly into every corner of the room, not spoken loudly, but understood completely. The courtroom did not erupt, did not break into noise or reaction. But something far more powerful settled into place, a quiet understanding that could not be reversed. Ava Williams remained seated at the bench, her posture steady, her presence grounded in something deeper than authority, something earned long before this moment. The record had been corrected, the imbalance addressed, but what lingered now was not tension, it was awareness. The kind that stays after words are spoken, after roles are clarified, after truth becomes visible in a way that cannot be ignored. Ava's gaze moved slowly across the room, not searching, not judging, but acknowledging. Each face she passed seemed different now, not because they had changed, but because they were finally seeing. The woman in the front row who had once avoided her eyes now held them for a second longer, her expression softer, more open. The man near the aisle who had leaned forward earlier now sat back, thoughtful, his attention no longer passive. Even the clerk moved with a new precision, his hands steady as he finalized the entries into the record, each motion reflecting the structure that had been restored. Ava's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the bench, the wood smooth beneath her touch, grounding her in the responsibility she carried. She did not rush the next moment. She allowed the silence to breathe, to settle into something complete. Then she spoke again, her voice calm, clear, carrying through the room without effort. "This court recognizes that justice is not only defined by outcome," she said, her tone measured, deliberate, "but by the integrity of the process that leads to it." The words did not challenge anyone directly, but they reached everyone present. Brooks stood where he had been, but his posture had changed fully now, no trace of earlier certainty remaining. His shoulders were aligned, his stance respectful, his gaze steady but no longer resistant. When Ava's words reached him, he nodded once, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. It was subtle, but it carried meaning. Ava held that acknowledgement for a brief moment, then continued, her voice steady. "Every individual in this courtroom contributes to that process," she said, "and every action within it either strengthens or weakens the trust it depends on." She paused, allowing the weight of that truth to settle fully, not forcing it, not repeating it, simply letting it exist. The light from the window had shifted again, brighter now, casting a warm glow across the bench and down onto the floor, softening the lines of the room that had once felt rigid. Dust no longer floated aimlessly. It moved with the light, visible, understood, part of something larger. Ava's gaze returned to the center, her expression unchanged, composed, grounded. "This court will move forward with that understanding," she said, her words final, not as a command, but as a shared responsibility. No one spoke in response. They did not need to. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with recognition, with correction, with something quietly restored. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, just enough to release the weight from her shoulders, her hands returning to rest naturally before her. The gavel remained untouched, its presence acknowledged but unnecessary. Order did not need to be enforced anymore. It had been re-established. Below her, Brooks adjusted his stance once more, this time with intention, his movements aligned with the structure of the room rather than against it. The clerk completed the final notation and set his pen down carefully, the soft click marking the end of something that had begun long before this session and would carry beyond it. Ava looked out one last time, her gaze steady, her presence unwavering. She did not need to say more. She did not need to add anything. The room had heard. The room had understood. And as the moment settled into stillness, it was not the authority of her position that remained, but the quiet, undeniable strength of how she had chosen to use it. The courtroom did not rush to its end. It settled into it, like a final breath released after being held for far too long. Ava Williams remained seated for a moment longer than required, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the silence that had formed, the kind of silence that carried meaning instead of emptiness. The light from the tall windows had shifted again, now stretching longer across the floor, brushing against the base of the bench and reflecting softly upward, illuminating the space in a way that felt warmer, more human. Ava's hands rested calmly before her, her fingers still, her posture composed, as if she understood that the most important part of the moment was not what she would say next, but what she would choose not to say. The room waited, not anxiously, but attentively, every person present aware that they had witnessed something that extended beyond procedure, beyond roles, beyond expectation. Ava lifted her gaze one final time, not scanning, not searching, but simply acknowledging the space as it now existed, balanced, corrected, understood. Then she reached for the gavel, her movement smooth, unhurried, her hand steady as it wrapped around the handle. She did not raise it high. She did not make a spectacle of it. She simply brought it down once, gently but firmly, the sound clear and resonant, echoing through the room with a finality that did not need repetition. "This session is concluded," she said, her voice calm, grounded, carrying the weight of everything that had led to that moment without needing to repeat any of it. The words settled immediately, accepted without question, without resistance. Chairs shifted quietly as people began to rise, not abruptly, not noisily, but with a kind of awareness that lingered in their movements. Papers were gathered, pens set down, briefcases closed, each action deliberate, as if no one wanted to disturb what had just been restored. Officer Daniel Brooks remained still for a second longer than the others, his posture upright, his gaze lowered briefly before lifting once more toward the bench. There was no defiance there now, no confusion, only a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that does not require words. Ava met his gaze for a brief moment, not to judge, not to remind, but simply to recognize the shift that had taken place. Then she gave the smallest nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, yet it carried something final, something complete. Brooks returned the nod, equally small, equally restrained, and then stepped back, his movements aligned with the order that now defined the room. The clerk organized the final documents with careful precision, stacking them neatly, his earlier hesitation replaced by clarity. The spectators filed out slowly, their voices low, their expressions thoughtful, each one carrying something different with them, but none leaving unchanged. Ava remained seated until the room had nearly emptied, her presence steady, her posture unchanged, as if she understood that the responsibility of the role extended beyond the visible moment. When the last of the movement faded, when the doors closed softly and the echoes settled into stillness, she allowed herself a single breath, deeper than the others, not of relief, but of grounding. She stood then, slowly, the chair shifting quietly behind her, her hand brushing once more against the polished wood of the bench. The light now fell fully across the surface, illuminating the space where she had sat, where she had held the room together not with force, but with control, with clarity, with restraint. Ava stepped down from the bench with the same measured pace she had used to approach it, each step deliberate, each movement aligned with the structure she had upheld. The courtroom was empty now, but it did not feel vacant. It felt settled, as if something had been placed back where it belonged. Ava paused briefly at the base of the steps, her gaze lifting once more toward the bench, not with attachment, but with understanding. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps quiet, steady, fading into the same silence that had once tried to dismiss her, but now held something entirely different. Not absence, not indifference, but the quiet, undeniable presence of justice, finally seen, finally felt, and left behind not as a statement, but as something that would remain long after she was gone.